All right, so we'll be doing blood. It's a pretty interesting chapter, but it's long also. And if you miss one concept, you won't really enjoy it, right? But it will be easier for you now because I'm sure that in home you've already done anemia. So they've already told you about a lot of components of blood, although they are mainly focusing on the hemoglobin content and the actual size and the volume of the red blood cell. Actually, they are focused on red blood cells, right? But at least you have an idea of what blood is, right? So my aim is to try and hopefully to try and finish everything by next week. If you are free on Saturday, maybe if you can push to it, maybe 4 sessions on Saturday, because I really want us to finish this chapter as soon as possible. It is long, but we can finish it as soon as possible so that you have more time to do it with your lecturers. Because I feel like if we are ahead and you do it with your lecturers, I feel like it's giving you more time to study and more time for you to recall a lot of things, because then, I mean, you got it from me, you're getting it from your lecturer, and you will get it again when you study yourself. So there's no way you won't understand. So without wasting any more time, what really is blood, right? So your blood is nothing else but a specialized connective tissue. That is what a lot of people tend to forget, that the blood is what is a connective tissue. You should never forget that. Always remember that blood is what? It's a specialized connective tissue, right? And it's composed of what? What makes up blood? The blood is made up by what? By the cell, by the matrix, and it's made up by cells, right? It's made up by the matrix and the cells. So we study which cells are involved and what's the matrix, right? So we all know that the blood makes approximately about, it accounts for about 80%, right? Or so, yeah, about 80% of your total body weight, right? So we spoke about blood when we were doing CVS. We spoke about the cardiac output and the amount of blood you're pumping. Your blood is pumping out a heartbeat and stuff. So those ones we won't entertain them because we did all those when we were doing the CVS, right? So you now know that the blood is what is the special connective tissue, which is composed of what? Of the matrix and the cells. Now the question is, what is the function of blood? What did we learn in CVS? We learned that obviously the blood has a lot of functions, but what we learned in CVS, one of the most important functions of blood is what? Is for transportation, right? It is responsible for transportation. Transportation of what? Of oxygen and nutrients, right? This transportation of oxygen and nutrients. Where is it taking this oxygen and nutrients? It's taking that to your tissues, right? That is where the exchange will happen, and then that is where we will get the deoxygenated blood, because these tissues will be giving us what? Carbon dioxide, which is going to give us another function of blood. What is the function of blood? It removes waste, right? It removes waste. What waste? It removes waste. The waste that we're talking about, it's your carbon dioxide. It also removes things like your lactic acid, things like your urea, your ammonia, and so forth, right? So another important thing, really important, what you should know is that we all know the importance of pH, right? And we all know what pH is. So I won't entertain that one. But what you should know is that the pH of blood should always be between 7.35 and 7.45. So the only difference is like 0.1, right? The only difference is 0.1. So we can see that is a really small difference, right? So it means that we must always make it a point that we are within this range of 7.35 to 7.45 to ensure that everything is functioning normally. So it means that for us to be able to do that, then blood has to come in, because blood is responsible for maintaining that, right? So It's responsible for maintenance of pH, right? It's responsible for the maintenance of pH in the body. And another thing that can be transported besides the oxygen and the nutrients, it's your hormones, right? Because we've already spoken about the hormones in the earlier chapters we did, right? We know why the hormones are important and the different pathways of hormones and all that, right? So it's the transportation of hormones as well. And blood is also important for retaining your temperature, ensuring that your temperature is at optimal, right? So it is the we can say the maintenance of what of thermal equilibrium, right? That is simply saying that we are maintaining the temperature, thermal equilibrium. And then one last thing is it's important for enhancing the clotting, right? But that one I won't because it is within the blood itself. So these are the major functions of the blood: transportation of oxygen and nutrients and your hormones. It also removes if it transports oxygen. Obviously, after oxygen is being used up, we'll get waste. What is the waste? It's your carbon dioxide. It also transports your lactic acid. When you were in matric, you spoke about the urea. When you were doing the kidneys, you also know about ammonia, right, as one of the wastes. So those are the example of the wastes that can be transported by blood as well. And then one important thing is that it is responsible for maintaining the pH, which should always be between 7.35 and 7.45, right? And it's important also for the maintenance of the thermal equilibrium, right? I hope that makes sense. I really hope that it makes sense. So the blood, if you don't understand, good people, or you feel like I'm too fast, please stop me. You now know what the blood is, what is the function of the blood and all that, right? So we want to know, we said that the blood is made up of what? It's made up of the matrix and the what and the cells, right? So it is composed of that matrix that we are speaking about. It's basically your what? So this is basically your composition of your blood, right? Composed of what? It's composed of, let me just say this person, sorry. It's composed of your plasma, right? So your plasma is the matrix that you're talking about. It's composed of your plasma, it's composed of the cells that we find there. It's your red blood cells, you have your white blood cell, and lastly, you have what? You have your platelets, right? So those are all the things that you find in the blood. This is what the blood composes of, right? So what you should know just for the actual volume of blood is made by the plasma, which accounts for about 55% or so of the volume of blood, right? So that is what I want you to know for you. Remember that we're just introducing this thing and we'll go deeper in each, right? For now, just know that the plasma, the blood, I mean to say, is composed of those four things, right? With your plasma making about 55% of the blood volume, right? So to start with, now that we've entertained the plasma, that very same plasma is containing major types of proteins, right? Which we did the proteins, right? So I won't entertain them and go back and tell you exactly the functions of the proteins and everything, because we did that in I think it was the second chapter, if I'm not mistaken, right? So one of the important proteins that we find in the plasma, right, is the albumin. We find three proteins there. It's your albumin. Number two, you find your globulin, which is your antibodies. And then you find your fibrinogen, right? Or fibrinogen, or however you want to pronounce it. But these are the three major proteins that we find in the plasma: your albumin, globulin, and your fibrinogen, right? So your albumin will be the one that is responsible for providing what we call the oncotic, or what we call the colloid osmotic pressure, right? So it is responsible for providing the what? Okay, we'll go into detail. Just for now, just know that the albumin is responsible for providing the what? The colloid osmotic pressure. Now, this is what I want you to know. If we have, and you learn this next year also. So everything I'm teaching, actually, if you've been listening to me and you understand everything we've been saying since from first chapter up to this day, and the chapters we are yet still to do, you won't have problems next year when you do anapath. But if you didn't, you were just reading to grain, then you'll be required to go back here, right? Because a lot of things will make sense. Not that you won't pass, but it will be a lot of work for you. So if you remember correctly, let me do this. You have your arteries, right? And you have your veins. What do we find between the arteries and
Abang,
yes?
you said albumin does what?
It is responsible for providing the colloid osmotic pressure.
Thank you.
Pleasure. So here in the middle, what do you have? You have what we call the capillaries, right? Or you have what we call the capillary bed, however, right? But it's your capillary, right? So let me say it's your capillary bed. So in the capillary bed, that is where the actual exchange of nutrients happens, right? You get your nutrients being given to the nearby tissues, and you get those tissues giving off the waste, and then that waste leaves you, right? But we know that before we get there, this sort of like divides, we get your arterioles, right? And here it's sort of like obviously branches, and you get your venules, right? So we have two important pressures that we have to know. The first one I've told you is your colloid osmotic pressure. Your colloid osmotic pressure, you find it this side, right? You find it at the beginning of what? Of the venules, right? Going that side. And then we have what we call the hydrostatic pressure. The hydrostatic pressure happens when? At the end of the arteries. That is the important thing that you should never forget. The hydrostatic pressure is increased, right? Not that it's not here, but it's increased when? At the end of the arterioles. The colloid osmotic pressure is increased when? At the beginning of the venules. I repeat, hydrostatic pressure is there in the arteries, but it's increased where? At the arterioles. And then the colloid osmotic pressure is there in the veins, but it's increased where? In the venules, right? It's not something that you will forget about, right? It's pretty easy. And then this, okay, we'll come back to it. We'll come back to it. Let me not confuse you. We'll come back to that one. Just know that for now. And then we go to the second protein being your globulin, right? Which is responsible for performing enzymatic functions, right? It performs functions that are performed by enzymes, right? So we can say enzymatic functions. But most importantly, it's involved in immunity, right? Or we can say it provides immunity, right? Let me just say it provides immunity. Remember, I said your globulins are what? Your globulins are your antibodies, right? Your globulins are basically your antibodies. We are going to learn about them. There's 5 of them. There's IgM, there's IgA, IgG, IgD, IgE, right? You learn about them and their different functions and all that, right? And then we come to the last protein, your fibrinogen, which is responsible for it will be polymerized, right? It will undergo the process of polymerization to be what we call the fibrin, right? It will be polymerized into fibrin, right? And when will it be polymerized into fibrin? When you have blood clots, right? But don't entertain that for now too much. Just know that fibrinogen, fibrin. It's easier to forget that. You just remove the OGEN at the end. So those are the major proteins, right? Not that they are the only proteins. They are the major proteins that you find in the plasma. I'm going to tell you about other proteins and their functions, right? But I'll just be quick on those ones. Any questions so far? Any questions so far? Time is not on our side. I really want us to study moving. Any questions? Anything that you didn't understand?
No questions. Can you hear?
Yes, I can now. Thank you. We moved. In the absence of questions, we move. Now, what are some of the extra proteins that you can find there except those three? We spoke about your albumin. We spoke about your immunoglobulins. There's another protein which is known as transferrin. This protein transferrin is responsible. Transferrin, you think transport, right? You think transport. So what is it transporting? It is responsible for transportation of what? Transportation of iron, right? And then we will learn where is it transporting the iron to and why, right? And then we have another a protein that is also involved in transport of copper, right? It is responsible for transport of copper. I mean, what is the name of that particular protein? It's your ceruloplasmin. So this is what you have to do. These proteins that I'm going to give you, the extra ones, you are going to encounter them and maybe you might be asked about them in the test, but this one, they really, I haven't really seen it, right? But remember, the motto is what? 100% or nothing, right? So I'll be giving you every information, right? Every information for you to be able to acquire the marks that you want, right? So another one that you will be seeing and we also talk about next year, it's what we call the C-reactive protein. The C-reactive protein, you see that you have your C3A, you have your C5A, you have all those proteins, right? They are involved in the complement system. And we are going to talk about some of them when we do immunity, right? But just know that for now, you have what we call the C-reactive protein, which is important in inflammation, right? It's important in inflammation. And then we discussed about the fibrinogen, and then we have what we call the coagulation factors, right? And then one of the transport, before I can even forget, one of the things that is involved in the transport is the protein that is known as haptoglobin, right? So you know that haptoglobin has to do with what? Immunoglobin, right? So your haptoglobin is involved in what? In the transportation of what? Of hemoglobin. But it transports the hemoglobin outside the red blood cells, right? So it's transportation of hemoglobin. Some of the proteins, your lecturer might not even mention them at all, right? So it's fine. And then while we are still on transport, another one, it's your, what do you call, hemopexin, right? You also have what you call the hemopexin. So your hemopexin will be involved in, there's something we call the heme, right? Obviously, you know this from the hemoglobin. If we break down hemoglobin, we get the heme, right? So the heme, it's responsible for binding the heme and transportation of heme, right? Let me just say heme binding and transportation. So just know those for now, right? Because otherwise we won't finish, because we'll keep on bringing the past. Remember the three major ones: it's your fibrinogen, albumin, and your globulin. Remember those ones. Those are the major ones. These ones are the extra ones that you also find in the plasma, right? So what is important, going to the major ones, right? I hope you got everything. What is important for you to know now is where these proteins are actually being formed, right? So your albumin, your fibrinogen, and your globulin, But your globulin, not all of them, right? About 50 to 80% of the globulins. But all those three major ones, they are formed where? They are formed in the liver. I repeat, those three major proteins, they are formed in the liver. But with your globulins, not all the globulins are coming from the liver. Some of the globulins, exception, let's see, except, let's say maybe 50% of the globulins, they are coming from where? They are coming from the lymphoid tissue. The other remaining maybe 50% is coming from the liver. But the fibrinogen and the albumin, they are coming there. They are coming from the liver. I hope that makes sense. I really, really hope that makes sense. So it's important for you to know where those proteins come from. We now know they come from the liver, know their names, know their functions. You will never go wrong. I don't think there's any question that they can ask you that you won't be able to answer. Remember that your osmotic pressure is also known as your 50% of the globulins, right? 50%, not necessarily 50 on the dot, about 50 to 80% of the globulins is synthesized in the liver. The remaining percentage is coming from the lymphoid tissue. What's good is that they won't ask you in terms of percentage. I'm just giving you more information. But just know that it's not all the globulins that are coming from the liver. Some of them synthesized in the liver, some of them in the lymphoid tissue. So I was saying that the osmotic pressure, sometimes if they don't say osmotic pressure, they will say oncotic pressure, right? So don't say that when they say oncotic pressure, don't say Charan didn't mention that one, right? Oncotic pressure, osmotic pressure, what do you want to call? Colloid, right? But when they say, they don't just say osmotic pressure, most of the time they say colloid osmotic, right? So it's one and the same thing, right? So we want to really discuss what the pressures are really in terms of the actual values, but just know that the albumin has the highest pressure of the three. Albumin has the highest pressure of those three major proteins. So if you're sorted with that, what you have to know also about all those three major proteins is that they are carriers of water insoluble substances. You remember when something is water, if it's water insoluble, it means that it doesn't like water, right? It's hydrophobic, right? So when it's hydrophobic, it means that it is lipophilic, right? If you still remember the terms. If it's hydrophobic, it's lipophilic. Lipophilic means that it is lipid loving. For the mere fact that it is a lipid, that is the reason why it can be able to dissolve in water. So the plasma proteins are also responsible for carrying such substances that are not being able to dissolve in water, right? So they carry those substances. But to be more specific with your albumin, it is responsible, or it acts as a carrier of what? Of steroid hormones. That is what you have to know about your albumin. And then on top of that, it can also carry your fatty acids and your thyroid hormone as well. But the major thing that you have to know is that the plasma proteins act as carriers for water insoluble substances. That is the number one thing that you have to know. And these proteins, they can also act as source of proteins themselves, right? What do I mean by that? Like, let's say, for example, when the tissue becomes depleted of proteins, it runs out of the proteins, the plasma proteins will be able to act as what? As the replacement for those lost proteins. It's thyroid hormones. What did I say else? Thyroid and your fatty acids. So that is what I want you to know about the plasma, right? That is what I want you to know about the plasma. This is basically the introduction, right? And while we are still there, there's something called, while we're talking about the plasma, there's something we call plasmapheresis. So what is plasmapheresis? Plasmapheresis is nothing else but a process in which your plasma can be removed from your blood without removing your red blood cells. So we only remove the plasma, right? We only remove the plasma. I hope everything makes sense. I really hope everything makes sense. If it's too much, let me know, but that can be too much because that was still the introduction. Did you understand everything I said? Did you understand everything I said? The meeting is left with 10 minutes. But I think I can do red blood cells. Yes, I'm glad, right? I really think I can do red blood cells. You'll forgive me, guys. If I'm too fast, please tell me. But I really want us to finish with this chat as soon as possible. So you now understand the plasma and everything we find in the plasma and the importance of it and stuff and stuff and stuff. Now, we also said that the blood constitutes of what we call the red blood cells, right? So your red blood cells, which is, they are also known as your erythrocytes, right? Anything in medicine that has to do with eryth, that starts with eryth, has to do with redness, right? Erythema is when you have swelling, and then that swelling, it looks reddish, right? Yeah. So anything that is eryth, right? If they say erythrotomatosis, right? Just know that that thing has to do with redness somewhere, right? So this is your erythrocytes, right? So your erythrocytes is another word for what? For your red blood cells. So your red blood cells are important for what? For the transportation of what? Of hemoglobin. Thus, they are able to, they contain, let me just say, they contain hemoglobin, right? So they contain hemoglobin, and thus they are able to transport what? Oxygen, right? Because the hemoglobin and the oxygen will attach, and that will form your hemoglobin. Sorry for that, right? But your red blood cells also contain large amount of the enzyme which is known as what? As carbonic anhydrase, right? We also have what we call the carbonic anhydrase. So what is the importance of the carbonic anhydrase? It helps water in blood to, it will help with the water in the blood to transport large quantities of carbon dioxide, right? And it will transport the large quantities of carbon dioxide in the form of what? In the form of what? In the form of bicarbonate. That one is very, very important, right? This carbonic anhydrase is important for helping water in the blood to transport large quantities of carbon dioxide in the form of bicarbonate. And then while we are still there, remember we said that the blood is responsible for the maintenance of pH, which is between 0.35 to 0.45. What helps blood to be able to maintain that temperature is actually your hemoglobin, right? It's actually your hemoglobin. How is the hemoglobin able to do that? Because the hemoglobin is known as what we call the buffer, right? You did the buffer system in metric, and you know that buffers are, you can say acid-base buffer. It is an acid-base buffer. You know that each and every buffer, you know it contains a weak acid and what. I won't go to the chemistry too much, but just know the importance of the buffer is to do what? It's for the maintenance of pH. So the hemoglobin is your what? Is an excellent acid-base buffer. So that is why blood is able to maintain that pH. Now you know what the blood and the red blood cells consist of and everything. So now I want us to entertain the properties of the, red blood cells, right? We all know that when it comes to the shape, to start with, that they are biconcave, right? They are biconcave, and what you have to know is that they also, what you call, okay, before I even forget, okay, I'll come back to it, but you have to know also that their lifespan is approximately 120 days. They are able to last for 120 days and they die, right? And we say the easiest way to remember it, when we say after 120 days they die, their gravesite, everything that dies has to be buried. So the gravesite of the red blood cells is what? It's your spleen, right? It's your spleen. Spleen is not one of the properties part. Just know that when the red blood cell dies, it goes to the spleen, right? It goes to the spleen. That one, don't forget it. It goes to the spleen. While we are talking about the red blood cells, if we only focus on the percentage of the red blood cells in the whole blood, remember you now know that the blood consists of any other cells like your white blood cells. It consists of your platelets and all those. But if we only focus on the percentage of the red blood cell out of the whole blood, we call that what? Hematocrit, which is about 45%, right? So hematocrit is what? Is the percentage of blood in, is the percentage of the red blood cells in the blood. There's no way they won't ask you this question. I've had with my life. No way. It's always there, right? One of the easiest questions. So remember that your hematocrit is what? It's the proportion of blood that is in red blood cells, or we only take the percentage of the red blood cells all over the amount of blood you have. I hope that makes sense. So obviously they will tell you that it differs in men and in women, right? And I really don't remember being asked the exact reason behind that, but just know that men tend to have more hematocrit than women, right? And if, since you learned about anemia, in severe cases of anemia, the hematocrit is very low. It can be low as maybe going from 45 to something like 10, right? That is what can happen. So that is what is important. But in everything that we've said, what is really, really important that defines the actual basis of the function of the red blood cells is the presence of hemoglobin, right? So your hemoglobin, if it was not there, the blood won't be able to carry what? To carry oxygen. So it might happen, and sometimes it happens that your hemoglobin is being um, destroyed, if I can put it like that, right? The meeting will end in 2 minutes, good people. So I really don't think I can be able to explain and finish in 2 minutes. So if you don't have questions, I will end the first session here. You know exactly what to do. You quickly come back and then I'll try to explain the destruction of the hemoglobin and what follows, because you really have to know that process. So if you have any questions, you'll ask me on the beginning, at the beginning of the session that is coming.